This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand. I'm Joe Hildebrand, and in case you haven't noticed, Donald Trump is Donald Trump. Still, yes, he is alive and he is kicking. We'll be getting into the real story behind the assassination. Plus, on the home front, are the Greens planning to destroy Labor? Spoiler alert, yes, I'll reveal how. Plus, is the CFMEU, or now as it's known, the CFMMEU, plotting to destroy Labor? Spoiler alert, yes. And we're going to get to the bottom of the Vietnam War myth that engulfed Australia. How were Vietnam vets actually treated when they came home? Well, the answer might not be what you've been told. We'll be speaking to the author of a new book who's uncovered the truth. All that and more coming up. Okay, but first, we've got to get it out of our system, just like America has to get him out of its system. Donald J. Trump, who is about to become the next president of the United States again. Yes, you can take that to the bank, put the house on it. In fact, he's actually saved the last few months of Joe Biden's presidency because now no one else wants to run against him. But we'll get to all that in a tick. But first, what led up to this assassination attempt in Pennsylvania? Well, I'll tell you what led up to it. All of Donald Trump's opponents from the very beginning. Now, it is just excruciating for someone who knows anything about politics, and there are plenty of me out there, don't get me wrong, I'm not pretending I'm the only one, but people I know who are smart political strategists as opposed to people who tell everyone how smart they are, who have been watching the Trump phenomenon and just going, oh my God, what are you guys doing? The very people who are supposed to be stopping Donald Trump are helping him. 90% of the reason why Donald Trump is going to be president, going to be elected president in November and sworn in January, 90% of the reason is his opponents. Actually, no, that's an exaggeration. 100% of the reason is his opponents. Now, I'm just going to take you back to say, 2020, when Donald Trump lost the election against Joe Biden. Now, as we all know, Joe Biden got a record number of votes, the biggest number of votes in any US presidential election in history. But guess who got the second biggest number of votes in US presidential election history? That's right, Donald Trump. All these votes, let's not forget, were just for Donald Trump. Despite everything he'd said, everything he'd done, everything he was accused of, the Biden votes, they came from a coalition that ranged from Sanders socialists to Romney Republicans, right? We had the Lincoln Project, all these soft, moderate Republicans who are rallying votes against Donald Trump. Then you had the entire Democrat machine, including people who were for the left of the Democrat machine or were barely in the Democrats in the first place, i.e. the Bernie Sanders mobs, the Trots. Right? All of them, although apart from a few crazies who decided to vote for Sanders and then Donald Trump because, Julian Assange, whatever. But all of them were aligned against Donald Trump. So it was Donald Trump versus the world. So if this guy can pull whatever it was, 76 million votes, just on his own, despite having bragged about grabbing women by the pussy, despite being accused of having sex with a porn star, despite everything, he still pulls the second highest number of votes in US presidential history. And you think it's all over? Well, guess what? It very nearly was, because Donald Trump did his very best to blow himself up. He basically, well, he didn't just basically, he accused the election of being rigged, said it was all crooked, said it was all bogus. This has been proven to be absolute crap. But anyway, he said it, his supporters believed it, and they rioted. They rioted on the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. It was called the insurrection. I'm not quite sure it was that. If it was the most disorganized insurrection I've ever seen in my life. But it was a bunch of crazies sort of running rampant, causing damage, yelling and screaming about freedom and whatever. This point was Donald Trump's lowest ebb. Nobody wanted a bar of him. Even former die-hard Trump supporters didn't want a bar of him. Even his vice president, Mike Pence, did not want a bar of him. And the Democrats had the Republicans by the balls. They had him in a squirrel grip because they were locked in this perfect paradox. None of the Republican candidates for the Congress and the Senate in the midterm elections, none of them could get pre-selection without Don say-so. Donald Trump controlled the Republican machine, but the rest of the electorate didn't want anything to do with him. So Trump pre-selected all these Trumpian candidates and they ran in the midterms and it was a fizzer. They predicted a red wave. They predicted a tsunami, a bloodbath. It was going to be like The Shining when the elevators open and the rivers of red just flow through. Instead, it was nothing. They barely even got control of the House. And even then, they couldn't elect a speaker. They kept going back and forth. It was embarrassing. It took forever. The Republicans were an absolute shambles. And again, they're locked in a catch-22 where the person who gets pre-selected cannot possibly be the person who wins. They can only get pre-selected with Trump approval, but the candidates Trump approves never meet with public approval. This is the most embarrassing thing. Donald Trump is meant to use this red wave as the platform, as the kind of the crest on which he surfs back into the presidency. And he announces this big, everyone's saying, yeah, he's going to do this big announcement. He's going to ride triumphantly and say, and I'm coming back. I'm coming back on the back of this big red wave. But the big red wave never happens. It's nothing. And everyone thinks, well, that's it for Donald Trump. Surely, even Donald Trump is not delusional enough to announce his presidency. Yeah, there's no way he can win it. He's dead in the water. He is DOA. But no, Donald Trump, ever the fantasist, holds the press conference at Mar-a-Lago anyway. It's amazing. There's chandeliers everywhere, gold everywhere. It's fantastic. And he goes on and on and on and starts rambling about the election being stolen. He doesn't really have any other policies. He doesn't really have any other platform. It's just it was rigged, crooked Hillary, whatever. He just wants to get back to get revenge. That's basically his entire platform. I should be president because I should be president. A bit like Malcolm Turnbull being prime minister. But let's not get into that. It goes on for hours, right? You've got people there who are crawling up the walls trying to get out, right? Everyone's just looking away. Even, again, diehard Trump supporters, people I know in Australia, diehard Trump supporters, just can't bear to look. It's like Kevin Rudd eating his earwax. No one wants to believe it. No one wants to know about it. He's got absolutely nothing to fight for. He's got blood on his hands from the January 6th insurrection, riots, protests, storming of the Capitol, whatever you want to call it. He's gone a bridge too far. Everyone is just turning their back on him. He's a joke. He's washed up. He's embarrassed. And what do his enemies do? They prosecute him. They decide that they're going to take him to court over this weird, bizarre campaign finance law that basically means that his payment of hush money to Stormy Daniels counts as a campaign expense and therefore it wasn't declared in the proper way, something like that. Now, this has already been looked at by federal authorities. It's already been looked at two sets of hands. The preceding state authorities in New York, where it eventually gets prosecuted, and the federal authorities. They both say, we're not going to touch this. There's no point. It's convoluted. He's gone anyway. But no. One crusader stands tall, and the left still want their revenge. They still want him to go to jail. And so they go after him. And so Donald Trump, who has been saying without a shred of evidence, against all the evidence, with the most delusional concepts of self-grandeur ever, saying, I'm a martyr. This billionaire property developer from New York says, I'm a martyr. I'm actually a victim here. The deep state's coming to get me. The government's out to get me. They're rigging the election. They don't want you to know the truth. They don't want you to be free. They don't want me to save you from the shackles of big government, from the sinister forces of the deep state. The state's coming after me. And what do? They come after him. They do what George Michael said in the song Freedom 90. All we have to do is take these lies and make them true. That's what Trump's enemies did. They took all the bullshit he was saying, all the absolutely deluded, mad conspiracy theories that were coming out of his mouth, and they made them true by using the justice system to go after a former president who was never going to get power again. He was washed up. They're just going after him out of spite. And what does going after him do? It fires him up again. It fires up his base again. And suddenly, he really is a martyr. Suddenly, he's got the mugshot to prove it. And suddenly, all the people who were sort of turning away from him start to turn back and say, hang on a minute, maybe he's right. Maybe they are out to get him. And this fills his campaign full of energy. The donations start flowing in. He got a record number of donations on the day that he was prosecuted. The day he was found guilty, the money just rolled in. This is the left trying to stop him. And they're filling his tank up with 98. And they are pointing that V8 all the way to the White House. But it doesn't stop there. Oh, no. So they go after him and after him and after him. And it turns out that the only bloke that he's definitely going to beat is the bloke that they've got going against him. It turns out that they're going to use a guy who they accuse of being too old and not knowing stuff and getting things wrong and making stuff up and not being reliable, not being of sound mind and body. And who do they put up against him? An 81-year-old dementia patient. And he just won't go anywhere. Even eventually when they say, oh, you know what? We were making it up. Yeah, he's not fine. Yeah, he's been out of it all along. We don't know. We thought you wouldn't notice. But yeah, we've got to switch him out now. But of course it's too late because the dementia patient doesn't know that he's the biggest liability to the Democrats since time began. Why? Because he's got dementia. And there's no mechanism to blow him out. So no one can persuade Joe Biden to take one for the team. Of course, this was going to happen. George Clooney weighs in with the okay of Barack Obama. They say, George, we're going to have to send you in. And then if that doesn't work, we're going to have to send in the other 10 from Ocean's 11. See if that works out. So they're finally going to blow him out of the foxhole, right? They're just going to keep lobbing bombs at Joe until he just has no choice but to go. But that was the plan. He would have lasted maybe days, right? And they could have had real fight in his hand if Kamala Harris maybe even, or a big shock candidate like Michelle Obama, although she would have had to kiss goodbye to about $250 million in campaign finance, as I explained last week. But anyway, anyone but Biden could have maybe given Trump a bit of a run for his money. And that's what they're about to do. They're about to switch him out, put in the big guns. And then what does some little trigger-happy trot do? A trigger-happy registered Republican trot, mind you. He decides, no, don't worry, guys, I got this. I'll take Trump out myself. Now, of course, he kills a completely innocent person, wounds a couple more others, and gives Trump the most incredibly emblematic, symbolic wound that does not even incapacitate him remotely, but looks fantastic on camera and provides the most iconic shot of 21st century American politics. Trump riding high, saying, fight, 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 with an incredibly, it's like put on by a Hollywood makeup department. A beautiful trickle of blood running down the right-hand side of his face as he holds his fist up against the American flag. You could not script this. Point being, this assassination attempt was not staged and was not made up by Hollywood, but it could have been. And this kid, who presumably wanted to stop Donald Trump getting the presidency, I mean, I don't know why you would aim to shoot them in the head if you did want them to be president, but, you know, let's assume, I think pretty safely, that he was an opponent of Donald Trump. This kid has, in fact, given him the perfect platform on which to win. Not just perfect, he is unbackable to win now. There is absolutely no way Donald Trump will not win. He cannot not win. A Democrat strategist said, and I believe the exact quote was, "We are so beyond f***ed now." Couldn't have put it better myself. So this kid tries to take Donald Trump out with a headshot after, you know, hitting a few other people first, ends up just clipping him in the ear. Trump survives, goes on to become president. Good. Why? Because if he had a shot Trump, it would make a Trump presidency look like a picnic. It would make the Trump presidency look like Anne of Green Gables. Because if Trump was shot by an assassin, America would immediately, and I mean immediately, explode into civil war. Think January 6th, and let's not forget, all of Trump's critics are saying that that was an attempted insurrection, an attempted revolution, an attempt to overthrow the government. All right, let's take them at their word. Imagine what these guys would do. Imagine what the man with the crazy bison hat would do. If someone actually shot Trump dead, if Trump was assassinated, not just that he lost an election, imagine if somebody killed him. Imagine what these people would do. And then you thought the Black Lives Matter, mostly peaceful riots were bad. Imagine what the left, imagine what Antifa would do if these guys rose up again. It would be carnage. It would be a bloodbath. America would literally be burning. At least Trump, if he becomes president, put up with it for 4 years, that's it. America's got it out of his system. And no, Robert De Niro, he's not going to declare himself dictator for life. If you want to move to China, you can see what that's like. His name's Xi Jinping. Anyway, point being, Trump survives. He's now absolutely unbackable to win. And Joe Biden, meanwhile, has been put into the, well, rather enviable position of actually doing what he should have done in the first place, which is taking one for the team. Joe Biden was meant to step aside for the sake of the Democrats, but now he's got to finish the job. Now he can't step aside even if he wanted to. No one's going to take his place because every single Democrat knows they're onto a hiding for nothing. They will be slaughtered, politically speaking, not in the way that Donald Trump almost was. So Joe Biden, because of his selfishness and because of his refusal to step down when he should have, is now going to be the political punching bag for Donald Trump, a resurgent Donald Trump, all his supporters. He is going to be the man who lost to Donald Trump when he didn't have to, the man who basically took the presidency off Donald Trump and then 4 years later just handed the keys of the White House straight back to him. That is now his legacy. Good thing is he won't remember it, so that's okay. Speaking of lefties who are out to destroy, well, the left, the Greens have unveiled their plan again to destroy and usurp the Australian Labor Party again. They keep announcing this plan. They haven't quite managed to make it actually come off. But according to a couple of articles, one in the Australian newspaper, the fine National Masthead, and the other in the Daily Mail, which is the greatest tabloid website that God himself ever created, the Greens are going to take over Labor as the major party of opposition. Now, I'll come back to very shortly just how insanely stupid this is and how it just means that the Greens are doing Peter Dutton's work for him. But first, a bit of background. Let's go to everybody's favourite Green, their housing spokesman, Max Chandler Mather. He has told the Daily Mail that the party plans to seize power in Australia by 2040. That seems far away when anyone other than Max Chandler Mather is going to be Prime Minister. With him as Prime Minister, it feels like it's very close. Feels like it's looming, I dare say. And he has released this projection. So again, they're just kind of making it up, that they've released to the Daily Mail, where they're saying that based on the 2019 results, where the LNP has 77 seats, the ALP has 68 seats, the Greens have 1, and Independents have 5. This is conveniently ignoring the fact that in the very next election, the ALP scored a majority. But anyway, that then goes to the 2040 results, and apparently miraculously, the LNP have just 57 seats now, the ALP has just 43 seats, and the Greens have 45 seats. So suddenly the Greens are the dominant power, the dominant party in a Labor-Green alliance. Suddenly Labor has become the kind of centre-left Greens, and the Greens are now the official, well, they're the government now because they've formed a coalition with Labor. They've got a combined vote, and this is just literally according to something the Greens have just written down on, I think a beer coaster is even being too generous to the amount of analysis and modelling that's gone into this. But anyway, the Greens have got 45 and Labor's got 43. So between them, they've got 88 seats compared to just 57. Wow, that's a landslide in 2040 when Max Chandler Mather becomes Prime Minister. Holy moly, might as well just call off the election. Why bother holding it? The results are already in. 15 years early. Fantastic. And Adam Bandt has also given an interview to The Australian where he basically says the same thing and says, we're coming for you. He's listed 10 seats that the Greens are going to target at the upcoming election. Funnily enough, 8 of them are Labor seats. So these big, heroic Greens, lefties, revolutionaries, fight the power, they're not coming after the Libs. They're coming after Labor in 8 out of 10 cases. And of course, all the seats that they already have basically come at Labor's expense, either seats that Labor would have won, in a couple of cases, more likely seats that Labor were already holding, that they've taken off Labor. And yet, they don't seem to quite figure out what they're doing because they accuse Labor of being a centre-right party. And they accuse it of being too much like the Libs. And they even say, Adam Bandt even says, well, we know that when we run against Labor, we've got to win in our own right because Labor and the Liberal Party will preference each other to keep us out. So we've got to win in our own right. So he's actually saying that the Greens need to get, 51% of the primary vote because the other two are going to just preference against each other, or 40% so that they can pick up a few nutty independents and minor parties and get over the line. The Greens are saying they, and whoever preferences them, have to get more votes than Labor and Liberal combined in all of these, let me check my notes, 45 seats that they're going to win in 2040. And so if by the Greens' own analysis, what they're doing means that Labor will join with the coalition, well, suddenly that kind of means that they're not in government. They are not in power because suddenly their 45 seats aren't combined with Labor's 43 seats because Labor's 43 seats go to the LNP's 57 seats. That gives them 100 seats compared to the Greens' 45 seats. So if the Greens are right in their own mind, in their own analysis of what this will do by forcing Labor and Liberal to do deals with each other, swap preferences, they either get knocked out at every seat they contest because Labor and Liberal share preferences and put the Greens last, which they will be doing in a number of seats at this upcoming election because of the Greens' crazy stance on stuff in at least some cases. Or they just force Labor into a coalition with the coalition, which would lock the Greens as the party of the left out of power for, I don't know, ever? And that would suit them quite well because, of course, if the Greens ever got power, it'd be an absolute disaster. We know what happened when they formed a coalition with Labor after the 2010 election. It was terrible. They immediately implemented a policy that everyone had voted against, and then Labor got absolutely destroyed for it. Didn't get just destroyed internally when Julia Gillard was then rolled for Kevin Rudd because she should have never rolled him in the first place. They didn't just get rolled at the next election where Rudd came back, lost by a landslide, possibly less of a landslide than Gillard would have lost by. But even the Greens themselves, after making Julia Gillard sign this political death wish, this political suicide note, after doing that, what did they do? They walked away from her. They abandoned her. They got up, Christine Mills got up and said, nah, we don't like what the government's doing. Screw them, they're on their own. They're not hardline enough for us anymore. Not extreme enough for us. And these are the people who are saying they're going to be forming government with a coalition with Labor, the people they've betrayed time and time and time again, the people they're still hurling insults at, the people who their supporters are harassing, who's outside their electorate offices. They reckon that these are the people who are going to get into bed with them again after it cost them government the last time round. Yeah, I don't think so. And just another quick one on the hard left. I've always had a slight soft spot for the CFMEU, the building union, at least in New South Wales. Other states, far more bolshy, far more militant. New South Wales hasn't been too bad. And also construction, building work, it's an extremely dangerous industry. You need a really hardcore, militant, maybe not militant, but you need a pretty heavy union to make sure that corners aren't being cut. And of course, they also end up getting too heavy and too militant and it just ruins everybody's days. But still, they're not too bad in New South Wales, terrible everywhere else. This, of course, brings us to John Setka, the leader of the Victorian division of the CFMEU, who's already been kicked out of the Labor Party, and there's now moves afoot to basically kick out the entire operation. Other state branches of the CFMEU, the national CFMEU, which is technically a separate body, it's all ridiculously complicated. Anyway, point being, Chris Minns, the Premier of New South Wales, who is an absolute superstar and got the best cheekbones of any politician of the 21st, 20th or 19th centuries combined. He's amazing. He's dreamy. He's just, and he runs, he's healthy, he's got, 3 kids, married to a nice lady who's always support. I just love him so much. Anyway, he's come out now and said, right, CFMEU, we're booting you out of the party. We are getting rid of you altogether. We don't want you. He's written to the General Secretary of the New South Wales Labor Party, Dom Offner, who is also an absolute superstar, and you can absolutely guarantee that the CFMEU will be expelled from the Australian Labor Party New South Wales branch. They will be disaffiliated. What does that mean in New South Wales? Well, not that much, except that it means that the CFMEU will no longer be able to have delegates at the ALP State Conference. That means the balance of power at said state conference will shift to the right of the party. The right still has the numbers, the state conference, but New South Wales is in a minority in Australia. Most states now, it's gone from being the right, the centre-right, the unity faction, whatever you want to call it, being the most powerful faction, to the left being the most powerful faction. Now, New South Wales, the right's managed to hold on because New South Wales is the home of the New South Wales right. The clue is in the name. But elsewhere, the story's a little bit different. Now, you've had Albo and Tony Burke, to their credit, saying, right, we're going to launch an independent investigation, independent inquiry into these things. We can't trust CFMEU to look into their own affairs. We've got that right. But were the CFMEU to be fully expelled from the Australian Labor Party, well, National Conference could look very different to what it does now. See, at the moment, National Conference is actually controlled by the left. The left have the numbers for the first time in a very long time. The left have the numbers at National Conference. That's why we saw most recently that silly little motion about Palestine and whether we recognise the disputed territories or the occupied territories. Stupid semantics put up by the left who were just obsessed with this issue. And this was basically, a deal was done so that the left would get their little change of wording, but then AUKUS, which is far more important, the Australian, UK and US submarine and strategic and security treaty, would get through. And so a little deal was done. Who cares about the wording? Well, it turns out the wording was pretty important because after that conference, October 7 happened, Hamas invaded Israel and all hell broke loose. And suddenly ALP is accused of selling out to Hamas, selling out to Palestine or whatever, hanging Israel out to dry. So sometimes those little semantics matter. But that was all because the left suddenly had the numbers at conference and could make life very, very uncomfortable for the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who is himself from the left, technically, but as Prime Minister has to govern from the centre and is, I can assure you, genuinely a centrist these days. He has come from the left, but he's now very much squarely in the centre, and he sort of outflanked Bill Shorten, who was from the right but started sounding like he was from the left. He outflanked Bill Shorten on the right in order to gain the Labor leadership. I could talk about that for about 6 days unbroken if you want me to, but I don't think you do. Point being, the left control the National Conference after just one branch of the ETU, the Electrical Trades Union, flipped from left to right. The New South Wales branch was a right-wing branch of what was otherwise a left-wing union, but it then flipped to the left, and that gave the left the numbers on the conference floor and basically meant that the left controlled the federal Labor Party, or at least the political wing of the party. The parliamentary party is a different story, but I won't bore you with that. If the CFMEU is booted out wholesale, those numbers shift right back. Now, I'm not sure if it would actually give the right the numbers, but it would be very, very, very close. And that might be why you see some reluctance among certain leading left-wing figures, including the current National Secretary of the National Labor Party, the ALP itself, as well as, of course, the leadership of the ACTU, which is currently left-wing, and other figures. I'm not counting Albo because Albo's awesome. Whatever he does is all right. But it could be that they are refusing to boot the CFMEU from the party altogether, the National Party apparatus, because if they do, the left could potentially lose the numbers on the conference floor. So just think about that next time you're thinking about whether or not Labor will do the right thing when it comes to rooting out all this union corruption or allegations thereof. So they could just be a very cynical political game, or they could make everyone's dreams come true, get rid of the CFMEU, let the right back in charge where they've always wanted to be, and let the left be the side of protest and whinging as they've always wanted to be. It's the natural order of things. Well, as you know on The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand, it's not just The Real Story with just Joe Hildebrand anymore, because we thought we'd bring in people who actually do know what they're talking about, people who have got big, big brains that we like to pick, and there is no one whose brain is bigger than my next guest. He is someone who, I'm going to tear up now and he's going to use this against me for the rest of both our lives.
I'm recording it.
He's someone who I absolutely had a massive man crush on ever since he started writing. He used to write these incredibly funny columns in The Good Weekend, which I just thought were amazing. It was just my kind of gonzo. It was just very special. He then decided that he didn't give a rat's about that. He left and decided to become something like a sort of military historian, among other things. And he's just written a new book that is an absolute banger. And you want to talk about the real story. This actually uncovers the real story about Australia's war myths. And he joins me right now. Mark Dappen, welcome. How are you?
Joe Hildebrand, I am sacked. Let's not pretend I drifted away from the Good Weekend column. Let's remember to bend the plastic. Push me ungently aside. Let's talk the true story.
Let's talk the real story about Mark Dappen sacking. You are the Norm Macdonald of Australian writers. But what a great... Sometimes I think, as someone who has also been sacked many times, I think the quality, the calibre of a man is measured by those who sack him.
I agree with you.
Think?
Hang on, he's measured by those. Yeah, but that means they've measured our calibre, found it wanting, and sacked us.
Yeah, but that means they're just wrong.
Yeah,
anyone who doesn't think we're awesome
is wrong
and worthy of huge amounts of money. Is a fool.
A fool. I like your work too. I always have, Joe.
Oh, stop it! No, but
I do.
It is all true. It is all true. And anyway, look, it's great to have you. I was reading. This is why I was reading on the weekend. There was a great piece in the Weekend Australian magazine about how this incredibly iconic, and it's strange for something to be so iconic when there's no actual sort of physical record of it, but this iconic idea that our Vietnam vets came back to Australia, they were abused, spat at, pelted, whatever, by all these horrible, angry hippies who were protesting the Vietnam War. And this is a really sort of incredibly, and I'm going to let you talk very soon, I promise, but this is an incredibly important part of Australian history. But you've done some investigation and found that it actually never happened.
Yeah, it hasn't been an important part of Australian history for very long. That's what surprised me about it initially. So I started working on this. I had actually done a bunch of interviews with the Vietnam Veterans Motorcycle Club, and they had told me... I probably spoke to about a dozen of them at their clubhouse, and they all told me parts of the same story. They all had this story that they came home and one said, I had blood thrown on me by students. Yep. They kind of built on that. And I sort of became interested in who the abusers were.
Yep.
I wanted to find out what these people had to say for themselves today, and indeed what the plan was, But... It didn't sound odd to me to start with. That isn't true. I didn't know anything about it, and I just assumed that what I was being told was true. But then I did start to wonder, I come from an army town.
Yeah.
And, students generally do not attack soldiers. It's
not a fight you want to start.
Not really.
You are not coming to this from these terrible lying vets making up rubbish or whatever. You are hugely into the military. You're fascinated by it. All your books seem to touch on it in one way or another. Your first book, Nashos, was about the forgotten sort of generation of Vietnam generation, the people who were conscripted and had to do national service. So you love these guys. You're coming at it from a position of someone who really loves and respects the military, just to be clear.
I don't love the military, but...
now you've just made me look stupid.
No, you did anyway.
You've got
these massive headphones on.
Sounds stupid.
Yeah, no, mate, sorry. I come from a position, I guess, of enormous sympathy for these guys. I've met... When I did my first book, The Nashos War, I interviewed probably 160 is the figure I say. I can't remember how many it was. National servicemen and regular soldiers, most of whom had fought in Vietnam. Then I did a doctorate at ADFA, or that was kind of at the same time. I spoke to many more Vietnam veterans.
The Australian Defence Force Academy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so there were obviously officers training. Most of the people at ADFA, apart from me and a few other postgrads, officer cadets. And I grew up in a garrison town, as I say. So I'm just kind of used to having the army around me. I'm used to talking to soldiers, and my heart does go out to these guys that at such a young age, at my son's age, almost at my son's age. were sent to Vietnam, and even the ones that weren't sent to Vietnam, even those people who had to do, the majority of national servicemen who had to do 2 years national service in Australia, it's a massive disruption to your life when you don't know any different. And that's kind of what interested me, like how they coped with that period of disruption. That's why I was interested in national servicemen initially over regular soldiers. And obviously that period of disruption was far worse for those who went to war. And then to think that when they came back, they were abused and rejected. It was a story that it was hard to understand. It was hard to understand why people would do it. It was hard to understand how people would do it. I started to look at this particular story, the idea that there were demonstrations at airports against soldiers who were returning. Like, A, why would you demonstrate against people who are coming back? But B, how would you do it? How do you organise a demonstration at an airport? Like, security at airports, even then, was tight. And soldiers coming back, they actually had to be paid. They have to be paid off by a paymaster at the airport. So there's military police there. There's armed military police. There's soldiers coming off the plane. These stories can't have happened. There's no record anywhere. Qantas have no record of them. The airport has no record of them. The so-called Skippy Squadron, who are the Qantas staff who ferried those soldiers who came back with Qantas back and forth from Vietnam, can't find record of them. And they've tried. There are no newspaper reports of these things happening. The first time anybody said anything about there being airport demonstrations anywhere in the world against Vietnam veterans was in the Jane Fonda movie Coming Home.
And let's just, we'll go into how this sort of came into being, but just quickly rattle off for us what the actual sort of myth, if you like, we can call it that now, was. What actually happened at Mascot Airport when these vets were supposed to have returned home?
Well, this particular story has, I think, 150 vets coming back into Mascot, relieved to get out of a war zone, to find themselves in, what is another Erzaz war zone. There's 350 students waiting for them with placards saying baby killers, and they come off the plane, the students spit, they throw tomatoes. There's quite often tomatoes in these stories, I don't know why. And then they get beaten up by the soldiers, which is what would happen in real life.
That's right. I mean, that part of the story really checks out.
There's no mention of the armed military police, what they were supposed to have done.
So you mentioned the official record of the contemporaneous evidence. There's nothing of this here
at all.
And it springs to life in, if I'm right, I think it was in the 1980s. Is that right?
The stories kind of begin to trickle out in 1982. I think that's the very first one that I traced, and that's quite a small example. A guy comes off a plane. I think he's met by 3 student protesters, one of whom is a woman, and she shouts at him, and the spittle, I guess, lands on him. But yeah, they really, really multiply around the time of the Welcome Home Parade in 1987. Right. And that's in part because Vietnam veterans had a huge voice around that time. They were more prominent than they had been since the return from Vietnam. But the point I guess I keep trying to make in my books is before that, there was no sense that this had happened. When the vets, you hear all these stories, there were no welcome home parades. In the final the edition of the Bulletin to mark the end of Australia's part in the Vietnam conflict in 1972, there's a big picture of welcome home parades and the caption, "Welcome home parades were a regular part of Australian life during the war." So we got a very different picture of what the homecoming was like now than what we had then. And it's been very interesting and surprising to trace, I guess, how that grew up.
And I think if I remember correctly, the detail and the sort of, I suppose, escalation of this story, because like so many other stories, if someone tells it, someone says, "Oh yeah, that's right, I remember that." And then they sort of,
Yeah.
But there was an exercise where vets were asked to write about their sort of experiences of coming home, either in a memoir as sort of what they remembered, or sort of as how they felt, or as a sort of imaginative kind of exercise in how they felt about things. And this is where that story came out of, wasn't it?
That's right. It came out of a creative writing class for veterans in WA and was first published in a pamphlet by, I think it was a DVA in WA to mark the homecoming parade. But yeah, some of the work that people did was memoir, some was fiction. and this is clearly fiction. There's no name attached to it. It's a bloke called Mike.
Yeah, right. So it's his anonymous account. He does his thing. It's a work of fiction, possibly a cathartic exercise for him.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's all cathartic. Revenge fantasies are,
That's right,
almost as cathartic as revenge.
So
I find.
And I find this fascinating as well, like not necessarily that, and you hear historians talk about this from time to time about other things, but it almost doesn't matter whether it happened or not so much as this is how this guy clearly felt. This is how he felt people were seeing him and what he felt they were thinking about him, even if the actual physical altercation never happened.
Yeah, I mean, it took me a long time to come to that conclusion. But yeah, you're right. I think it's very difficult to explain a feeling to someone. They come back and they feel rejected by students. Well, it's quite easy to see how they could have done.
Well,
There were students demonstrating in the streets
right,
about the Vietnam War. They feel that the banners are aimed against them. When they see a banner saying in a picture of a demonstration that says, "and babies," talking about my life, then they feel they're being called baby killers. They feel they're having these placards waved in their faces. But if you say, "Oh, I feel like people don't like me," you go, "Oh, yeah." But you put flesh on those bones. You give it a story. You give it actuality. You give the enemy a face, and people understand the story that way. I think that's why they.
And that's what I found extraordinary. I mean, I just happened to have finished reading a history of Stalingrad in World War II, which is the most miserable thing you could possibly do. If you're feeling too happy and you want to get depressed, read that book.
Bevo's book?
Bevo's book, yeah. It's incredible, obviously. But
I've already upset myself with it.
That's what I think. Every time people see it, they sort of react, "Oh my God, have you read that?" Yeah. But I suppose just that idea that, you're going over there, you don't know if you're going to make it back or not. You're going, you're very possibly going to die, and then to come back either intact, traumatized, wounded, knowing that mates of yours have died, and then to be told that not only was it kind of all for nothing, but that you were on the wrong side, that must really screw with people. Like that must, and again, that is why I think you would have someone writing that thing, that this is what it feels like when you say, "I risk my life for an evil cause, for a bad cause." That's a horrible thing to have to be told.
Yeah, I think there is that. But also, there's this kind of idea that's developed that the anti-war movement had hegemony, and everybody felt this way about the vets, and they didn't at all.
That's right,
It was hugely popular in conservative Australia. National service was hugely popular. The Vietnam War was really popular. What became less popular was compulsory national service overseas.
Yep.
But there was never were there fewer than 50% of the population supportive of the Vietnam War. So a lot of vets don't have these stories. I get lots of emails from the 6 or 7 people who've read my books. They all said, "I like them to
I hope
send me
they're the
lots
same
of
people who
emails."
listen to this podcast, because we need that crossover.
Saying, I had a great homecoming. I don't know where this comes from. They were massively supported and celebrated. Many of them.
Fantastic. Well, look, I think it just makes the history that much more fascinating. You've done an extraordinary job. I could talk about it all day, but we almost already have. It's Lest by Mark
Just
Dappen,
feels that way.
Australian War Myths. There are plenty more that Mark gets into, and I can't recommend it enough, even though it just arrived today and I've only started reading it. But it's so good.
But he's right. He's so right.
He's so right. He's so right. He's a brilliant writer. I love him. And thanks for coming on the show, my friend.
Thank you for asking.
Love your work.
Thank you.
Okay, and now to your questions. I'm sorry I've been gibbering on this week, so I've only got time for one question. Irene has written in saying, "Hey Joe, big fan of the podcast." Thank you, Irene. I'm a big fan of you. "I just wanted to know your thoughts on what a Trump win would mean for Australia. Would we be better or worse off?" Irene, that is $1 million question. In fact, it's a multi-billion-dollar question. Obviously, the big thing for Australia is what it would mean for the AUKUS Security Pact. And as I've sort of said before, it's not just about submarines, although we do want to get some submarines. We'll probably get them sometime at the end of this century if we're lucky. But it's about just reaffirming that incredibly close, special relationship that Australia has with the US, who, of course, we would be expecting to come to our aid in the event of China invading us or a regional war around Taiwan or something like that. And, of course, if the Poms want to come too, that'd be nice. We could use a couple of Harrier jump jets or whatever, But anyway, the more the merrier. But, again, we need America at our back for strategic and security purposes. And so anything that undermined that would be a bit of a worry. And so while I just love the Trump show, can't get enough of it, I'm the last person, I'm not the sort of orange man bad sort of Trump hater, just because he's so incredibly entertaining. And again, as I pointed out, it's not useful. If I had to vote, I'd vote Democrat, but he's just so much fun to watch. If Trump does become, as he was in his first presidency, more isolationist, less interested in America's role as a global peacekeeper, less interventionist, then that could mean that he's less concerned about AUKUS, and that could mean, for example, that he says no, and people have raised concerns about this already, no, we're not going to give you these nuclear submarines because we need them ourselves. America's security has to come first, and there's a long sort of history of sort of America first, isolationist foreign policy. I'm also worried about what it would mean for the war in Ukraine. I know that doesn't directly involve Australia, but there are plenty of noises from both Trump and his new Vice President, J.D. Vance, who I also otherwise find very, very interesting, but that they are sceptical about Zelensky and Ukraine's claim, that they are perhaps even sympathetic to the idea, wrongly in my view, that Ukraine sort of brought this on themselves and that Putin has some kind of strategic or historic justification for invading. So I'd be worried about that just from a kind of humanitarian standpoint, because if all the support from America dries up, that makes Ukraine's job a lot harder. They rely a lot on American funding and equipment. And if they withdrew from AUKUS, or if AUKUS was watered down, or we didn't get the full consignment of subs that we ordered, which again, going to be a long time coming at the best of times, then that could be a bit of a problem. So I have to say we'd probably be worse off in Australia. Having said that, Trump would be so entertaining that maybe that would make up for it. Anyway, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Real Story. If you love what you hear, of course, leave a rating and review. And if you hate what you hear, don't tell a soul. If you want us to cover anything on the pod, I don't say pod, I'm 48 years old, for God's sake. On the podcast, reach out via our socials, via email, therealstory@novapodcasts.com.au, or you can slide into my DMs on the gram. My handle is @Joe_Hildebrand. And of course, you can always read my columns every Monday and Saturday in the Daily Telegraph. Take care. Thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you next week.